A woman wearing a MAGA hat sees a black boy taking photos in a park and instantly assumes that he is up to no good, so she has a meltdown and calls the police, only to find out that the officer is the boy's father and the captain of the police. The late afternoon sun bathed the park in a golden hue, its rays streaming through the branches of towering oak trees. The laughter of children filled the air, blending with the rhythmic creak of swings and the distant hum of a lawnmower from a nearby house. David Carter adjusted the strap of his camera bag and knelt by the edge of the sandbox, angling his lens toward the small hands of a toddler constructing a lopsided castle. The boy giggled as he crushed the structure with his fist, earning a playful scold from his mother. David smiled faintly behind the camera, snapping the moment for his school project on everyday beauty. The scene was peaceful, untouched by the turbulence of the world beyond the park's gates. David glanced around, searching for his next subject. His gaze landed on a weathered bench under a sprawling tree, its surface etched with decades of initials and declarations of love. As he stepped closer, the sound of sharp, quick footsteps broke through his concentration. "Excuse me!" A woman's voice cut through the ambient noise, its tone sharp enough to turn a few heads. David turned, startled to see a middle-aged woman marching toward him. Her bright red MAGA hat stood out against the earthy tones of the park, and her small, yapping dog strained against its rhinestone-studded leash. "Yes?" David asked, lowering his camera slightly. Karen Whitman stopped a few feet away, planting her hands on her hips. Her dog barked incessantly, and she tugged the leash sharply to quiet it. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice laced with suspicion. David blinked, unsure of the question's intent. "I'm just taking photos for a school project," he replied politely, gesturing to his camera. Karen's eyes narrowed. "Photos? Of what? Of me?" Her hand instinctively went to her hat, as though shielding it from an invisible lens. "No, ma'am," David said evenly, though her tone unsettled him. "I'm capturing the park, the trees, the benches, moments of life." "It's for an art class assignment." "Art class?" Karen's skepticism deepened. She looked him up and down, her gaze lingering on his backpack, his sneakers, and his dark skin. "You don't look like you're here for art. Are you even from this neighborhood?" David's jaw tightened. He adjusted the strap of his bag and kept his voice calm. "Yes, ma'am. I live nearby. I'm not doing anything wrong." Karen scoffed, her dog now silent but fidgeting at her feet. "Well, you look out of place to me," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for David to hear. David took a breath, steadying himself. "I promise. I'm just here to take photos. If you'd like, I can show you my camera roll." Karen's face twisted into a scowl. "I don't need to see anything. What I need is for you to leave before you make people uncomfortable." David's heart pounded, but he stood his ground. "I have every right to be here, ma'am. I'm not bothering anyone." Karen stepped closer, her voice rising. "Listen, young man, I don't care what you're claiming to do. This is a family park, not some hangout spot for troublemakers. If you don't leave, I'll have no choice but to call the police." The tension hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. A few park-goers had paused, their gazes darting between the two. David looked around briefly, catching glimpses of concerned faces, but no one stepped forward. David steadied his voice. "I'm not leaving. If you feel the need to call the police, go ahead." He turned back toward the bench, lifting his camera to take another shot, though his hands trembled slightly. Karen huffed, pulling out her phone. "Fine. Don't say I didn't warn you." She began dialing, speaking loudly into the receiver as she walked a few steps away. David exhaled, his fingers tightening around the camera. His peaceful afternoon had just been shattered, and he knew the next moments would test him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Karen paced back and forth, her phone clutched tightly in her hand, as she spoke loudly to the 911 operator. Her words carried an edge of urgency, carefully chosen to paint David as a menace. "Yes, there's a young man here. He's loitering in the park, acting suspiciously. He's refusing to leave, and I feel unsafe." She cast a pointed glance at David, her lips curling into a smug smile as though daring him to react. David stood still, his camera dangling around his neck, his fingers gripping the strap. A few onlookers had gathered nearby, their conversations hushed as they watched the unfolding scene. "You really think this is necessary?" David asked, his voice calm but tinged with disbelief. Karen ended the call, slipping her phone into her pocket with a triumphant look. "Absolutely. You're wandering around here with that camera, making people uncomfortable. I don't know what you're planning, but it's suspicious." David tilted his head, incredulous. "Suspicious? I told you. I'm working on a school project. I'm not bothering anyone, and I'm certainly not a threat." Karen crossed her arms, her dog yapping again as though echoing her indignation. "Not a threat? How do I know that? People like you don't exactly inspire trust." David's jaw tightened, her words cutting deeper than he wanted to admit. He took a step forward, careful to keep his tone steady. "People like me? What does that mean?" Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "You know exactly what I mean," she snapped. "You don't belong here. This is a safe neighborhood, and I won't let anyone ruin that." David exhaled slowly, his frustration simmering just beneath the surface. "You keep talking about safety, but who am I endangering? I'm standing here with a camera, taking pictures of trees and benches. You're the only one causing a scene." Karen laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and mocking. "Causing a scene? You're the one acting defiant, refusing to leave when asked politely." "Politely?" David asked, his eyebrows raised. "You threaten to call the police because I'm standing in a public park. How is that polite?" Karen's cheeks flushed, her voice rising to match the tension. "This isn't about the park. It's about respect. Something you clearly weren't taught." David shook his head, his composure barely holding. "Respect is earned, not demanded. You came at me with accusations and threats, and now you're talking about respect?" The crowd murmured softly, a few whispers drifting toward Karen. "She's taking it too far," someone said. Another person nodded, their disapproval barely concealed. Karen turned toward the small group, glaring. "What? You think I'm the problem here? You don't know what it's like trying to keep this neighborhood safe." A man from the crowd stepped forward slightly, his arms crossed. "Lady, he's a kid with a camera. He's not doing anything wrong." Karen pointed a trembling finger at the man. "You think you're helping? You're encouraging him. This is why neighborhoods go downhill." David's voice broke through her rant, low and firm. "You can scream all you want. It doesn't change the fact that I have the same right to be here as anyone else. You don't get to decide who belongs and who doesn't." Karen opened her mouth to respond, but the distant wail of sirens cut through the air. Her expression shifted to one of smug satisfaction as she straightened her posture. "They'll sort this out," she said with a smirk. "We'll see how much your attitude helps you when the police get here." David stood tall, his heart pounding as the sirens grew louder. He clenched his fists, drawing strength from the determination to stay calm. "Yeah, we will see," he said softly, the weight of the moment settling over him. The sound of the police car pulling up silenced the park. Karen took a step forward, already prepared to spin her narrative, unaware of the twist that awaited her. David lowered himself onto the park bench, his camera resting in his lap. His chest felt tight, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He focused on his breathing, steadying the nerves that threatened to overwhelm him. Around him, the park buzzed with tension. Some onlookers whispered among themselves, while others simply watched in silent disapproval of Karen's actions. Karen, however, remained undeterred. She paced in front of the bench, her dog trailing nervously behind her. Her eyes burned with righteous fury as she pointed an accusing finger at David. "You think you can just sit there like you've done nothing wrong?" she spat, her voice loud enough to draw attention from across the park. "You've got some nerve, acting all innocent." David didn't respond. His fingers gripped the camera strap tightly, his knuckles white. He glanced down at his lap, refusing to meet Karen's gaze. "Oh, so now you're going to ignore me?" Karen scoffed, stepping closer. She leaned over him, her shadow stretching across the bench. "Typical. You people always think you can play the victim. Let me tell you something, young man. Nobody here is buying your act. David's heart pounded, but he kept his voice calm. I'm not playing anything. I'm just waiting, like you asked. The police will sort this out. Karen snorted, shaking her head. Sort it out? Oh, they'll sort it out all right. They'll take one look at you and know exactly what's going on here. David looked up, his eyes meeting hers. And what exactly do you think is going on? Karen leaned in closer, her face inches from his. You're here to cause trouble, that's what. Snooping around with that camera, pretending you're just some kid doing a school project. I wasn't born yesterday. David raised an eyebrow. You think I'd go to all this trouble just to bother you? That doesn't make any sense. Karen waved a dismissive hand. Don't play dumb. You're not fooling me. I know you're kind, always lurking around where you don't belong. Just waiting for the chance to ruin something nice. David's jaw clenched, but he forced himself to stay seated. The weight of her words hung in the air, sharp and heavy. He wanted to lash out, to yell, but he knew that would only give her more fuel for her fire. I'm not here to ruin anything, he said, his voice steady but firm. I'm here to take photos. Just like I told you. If you can't handle that, maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here. Karen recoiled, her face reddening. For a moment, she was silent, her mouth opening and closing as though searching for the right words. Finally, she straightened up, smoothing the front of her shirt. You've got a real attitude problem, she snapped, stepping back. It's no wonder this country's falling apart with people like you running around. David shook his head, his voice quiet but resolute. You keep saying, people like me. What does that mean? Go ahead. Say it. Karen glared at him, her lips pressed into a thin line. I don't have to explain myself to you. The distant sound of sirens grew louder, cutting through the tension like a blade. Karen's expression shifted, her smug confidence returning. Well, looks like your little charade is about to end, she said, crossing her arms. David remained seated, his fingers brushing the smooth surface of his camera. He didn't reply, his focus shifting to the approaching police car. He knew the next few moments would change everything, but he wasn't sure how. The car pulled up to the curb, and a tall man in a police uniform stepped out. Karen's face lit up, her confidence surging as she waved him over. Officer, over here, she called, striding toward him. David's stomach tightened as he watched the man approach. Then, to Karen's confusion, the officer smiled and said, David, you okay, son? The color drained from Karen's face as she froze in place, her smugness evaporating in an instant. Karen's eyes darted between Marcus and David, her face a mix of confusion and defiance. The smugness she had when calling the police began to fade, replaced by frustration. Wait a minute, she said, her voice rising. You're his father? Yes, ma'am, Marcus replied evenly, his eyes locked on hers. And I'm also the captain of the precinct that responded to your call. Now, can you explain exactly why you felt the need to report my son? Karen blinked rapidly, caught off guard. She glanced at the growing crowd of onlookers, their disapproving gazes fueling her agitation. I already told you, she snapped. He was wandering around, taking pictures, acting like he owned the place. I didn't know who he was or what he was doing. Marcus folded his arms across his chest, his voice steady. He told you he was taking photos for a school project. That's what he's been doing. So, again, I'm asking, what about that made you feel unsafe? Karen bristled, tugging sharply at her dog's leash. You have no idea what it's like to have to watch out for this kind of thing. People come into neighborhoods like ours and cause trouble. I've seen it before. David, still seated on the bench, frowned. People like me? Karen spun toward him, her face flushing. Don't twist my words. I meant people who don't respect the rules, who think they can just waltz in and do whatever they want without consequences. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Rules? Which rules exactly? Did my son break by sitting on a public bench and taking photos? Karen threw her hands in the air, her frustration boiling over. It's not just about rules. It's about common sense. He didn't belong here. He doesn't live here. How was I supposed to know he wasn't up to something? David finally stood, his camera hanging from its strap around his neck. His voice was calm, but firm. I do live here. And even if I didn't, this is a public park. You don't own it. And you don't get to decide who belongs. Karen's face twisted in anger. Watch your tone, young man, she snapped, pointing a trembling finger at him. I'm not the bad guy here. You're the one acting suspicious and disrespectful. Marcus stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Ma'am, I need you to lower your voice and calm down. There's no reason for this to escalate further. Karen glared at him, her eyes flashing with indignation. Calm down? You're telling me to calm down? I'm the one who felt unsafe. And now you're treating me like the criminal. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder. A man in the back shouted, Maybe because you're acting like one. Karen whipped her head around, glaring at the group. Mind your own business, she barked. Marcus took a deep breath, keeping his composure. Ma'am, let me remind you that filing a false police report is a serious offense. From what I've seen so far, there's no evidence to support your claims of feeling threatened. Karen's face turned red, and her voice grew shrill. This is unbelievable. I try to protect my community, and this is how I'm treated? You're taking his side because he's your son. This is bias. Plain and simple. David shook his head, his voice cutting through her rant. No, this is justice. You can't just call the cops on someone because they make you uncomfortable. That's not how it works. Karen jabbed a finger in his direction, her composure unraveling. You don't get to lecture me, boy. You don't understand what it's like to be a responsible citizen in a good neighborhood. You're lucky I didn't press charges. Marcus's expression hardened, his voice dropping into a measured, authoritative tone. Press charges for what, ma'am? Sitting on a bench? Taking photos? You're digging yourself into a deeper hole with every word. Karen let out a frustrated huff, her hands trembling as she clutched her dog's leash. This is ridiculous. You're all against me. You're twisting this to make me look bad. Marcus's tone remained calm but firm. Ma'am, no one here twisted anything. Your own words and actions are doing that. I suggest you step back and think very carefully about how you proceed. Karen's anger boiled over, her voice rising above the crowd's murmurs. This is harassment. I'll file a complaint against you and your son. You'll both regret this. The crowd gasped at her outburst, their murmurs turning into outright condemnation. David stared at her, unshaken, as Marcus maintained his unflappable stance. Ma'am, Marcus said evenly, I think it's time for you to leave. Karen's chest heaved, her face a mask of rage. Oh, I'm not going anywhere. Not until I get justice for how I've been treated. Marcus's expression didn't waver as he stepped closer, his tone resolute. Then I suggest you sit tight, because there will be accountability for what happened here today. But it won't be on my son. The confrontation hovered on the edge of breaking completely, as Karen's anger surged further, setting the stage for the escalation to come. Karen's chest heaved as her indignation boiled over, her composure completely shattered. Her hands clenched the leash tightly, her trembling fingers betraying the storm of emotions within. The crowd watched in stunned silence, their murmurs growing louder as Karen glared at Marcus with unbridled fury. You're protecting him, she shouted, her voice shrill. You're not a real officer. You're a fraud, just like him. Marcus stood his ground, his tone calm but firm. Ma'am, I'm warning you. Your behavior is becoming a public disturbance. You need to step back and calm down before this gets out of hand. Karen's face twisted in rage. Don't you tell me what to do. You don't have the right to lecture me. This is my neighborhood, my park, and I won't stand for this. The crowd stirred uneasily as Karen took a step closer to Marcus, her fists balled at her sides. Marcus remained steady, his tall frame radiating quiet authority. Ma'am, he said, his voice lowering, this is your last warning. Step back. But Karen's anger had reached its peak. You think you're so much better than me, don't you? She hissed. Her voice grew louder, each word laced with venom. You come in here strutting around, acting like you own the place. She suddenly lashed out, shoving Marcus hard in the chest with both hands. The force was enough to make him take a step back, though he remained balanced. The crowd gasped audibly, and David instinctively moved forward, his heart racing. "Dad!" David shouted, his voice filled with panic. Marcus raised a hand, signaling for his son to stay back. He adjusted his footing and locked eyes with Karen, his expression cold and unyielding. "Ma'am, you just assaulted an officer," he said, his voice like steel. Karen's eyes widened slightly, but her fury quickly masked any hint of regret. "Don't act like you're some kind of victim," she snapped, pointing a shaking finger at him. "You've been harassing me since you got here." Marcus took a slow step forward, his voice dropping to a level that silenced even the most restless onlookers. "Let me be very clear," he said, enunciating each word. "If you touch me or anyone else here again, I will arrest you for assault." Karen's face contorted with disbelief. "Arrest me? For defending myself? You're out of your mind." She jabbed a finger toward the crowd. "You all saw it. He provoked me. He's abusing his power." The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, with several people shaking their heads in disgust. A young woman near the front crossed her arms and shouted, "We saw everything. You're the one attacking him." Karen's rage flared again at the comment, and she took another step toward Marcus. "Shut up!" she screamed at the woman before spinning back to Marcus. "And you? What are you going to do about it? Arrest me for standing up for myself?" Marcus's patience was wearing thin, but his composure remained intact. He pulled out a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "Ma'am, if you don't stop right now and leave the park, I will have no choice but to detain you." Karen's defiance wavered, but her pride refused to let her back down completely. "Oh, go ahead! Arrest me!" she shouted, throwing her hands up dramatically. "Show everyone here how you treat innocent people just trying to protect their neighborhood." David stepped closer, his voice steady but firm. "You're not innocent, and everyone here knows it." Karen turned toward him, her face red with fury. "Don't you talk to me, boy!" she spat, her voice cracking. Before Marcus could react, Karen took another step forward, raising her hand. But Marcus moved quickly, grabbing her wrist in midair. His grip was firm but controlled, and his expression remained composed. "That's enough," Marcus said sharply. He reached for his radio, his voice steady as he spoke into it. "This is Captain Carter. I need backup at the park. Suspect is resisting and has assaulted an officer." The crowd erupted into murmurs and gasps as Karen struggled against Marcus's grip. "Let me go!" she screamed, twisting her arm. "This is abuse! You're abusing me!" Marcus released her wrist and stepped back, positioning himself between her and David. "Ma'am, sit down on the bench and wait quietly, or I will restrain you." Karen stumbled backward, her face pale with shock and rage. She looked around wildly, as though searching for someone to come to her defense, but the crowd's disapproving stares offered no support. "You'll regret this," she shouted, her voice cracking with desperation. "You'll both regret this." Marcus didn't reply, his focus unwavering. The sound of distant sirens cut through the air, signaling the arrival of backup. Karen's eyes darted toward the sound, and for the first time, fear flickered across her face. Karen stood frozen, her chest heaving as the wail of sirens grew louder. Her dog whimpered at her feet, pulling gently at its leash. But Karen didn't move. Her eyes darted wildly between Marcus and the approaching patrol car. A mix of fury and panic etched across her face. The crowd stirred, some stepping closer to get a better view of the unfolding drama. Their murmurs filled the tense silence, rippling through the park like an undercurrent of judgment. "Looks like she's finally getting what she deserves," someone muttered, loud enough for Karen to hear. Her head snapped toward the crowd, her face twisting with anger. "You don't know anything!" she shouted, pointing a trembling finger. "I'm the victim here! They're all ganging up on me!" Marcus took a slow step forward, his presence commanding. His voice was calm but firm, cutting through Karen's rant. "Ma'am, the time for excuses is over. You assaulted an officer and created a public disturbance. When backup arrives, I'll be placing you under arrest." Karen's face turned pale. "Arrest? For what? I didn't do anything wrong. You're abusing your authority." David stood a few feet behind his father, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "You shoved him in front of everyone here," he said, his voice steady. That's not abuse. That's assault. Karen glared at him, her lips curling into a sneer. Of course you'd say that. You're just as bad as he is. Before Marcus could respond, the patrol car pulled up, its lights flashing. Two uniformed officers stepped out, their gazes scanning the scene. One of them, a younger officer, approached Marcus with a respectful nod. "Captain Carter," the officer said. "What's the situation?" Marcus gestured toward Karen, who stood stiffly with her fists clenched. "This individual filed a false police report, created a public disturbance, and physically assaulted me. She's refusing to comply." The officer glanced at Karen, his expression neutral but professional. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to turn around and place your hands behind your back." Karen's eyes widened, and she stumbled back a step. "What? No, you can't do this. This is a misunderstanding." Marcus remained composed, his tone unwavering. "You were warned multiple times, ma'am. Actions have consequences." Karen's panic morphed into desperation. She turned to the crowd, her voice shrill. "You all saw it. He provoked me. This is a setup. They're trying to humiliate me." The crowd murmured in response, but the disapproval in their faces was undeniable. A middle-aged woman in the front crossed her arms and shook her head. "No one provoked you," she said loudly. "You brought this on yourself." Karen's jaw dropped, her gaze snapping to the woman. "How dare you!" she screamed, her voice cracking. The younger officer stepped forward, his voice firm. "Ma'am, this is your last chance to comply peacefully. Please turn around and place your hands behind your back." Karen's defiance wavered as her breathing grew shallow. Her gaze shifted back to Marcus, who stood tall and resolute, his arms crossed. "This isn't over," she hissed. "You'll regret this. All of you will." She turned slowly, her shoulders stiff, and held out her hands with a dramatic sigh. The officer quickly and efficiently placed handcuffs on her wrists, reciting her rights as he guided her toward the patrol car. The crowd watched in silence, their judgment palpable. A young man near the back let out a low whistle. "Well, that's one way to make an exit." Karen shot him a withering glare as she was placed in the back seat of the patrol car. Her dog barked plaintively, and one of the officers handed the leash to a member of the crowd who offered to take care of it. Marcus turned to the crowd, his voice steady and authoritative. "Thank you all for remaining calm during this situation. If anyone has further concerns, you're welcome to contact the precinct." The crowd began to disperse slowly, though a few people lingered, exchanging quiet remarks about the incident. Marcus turned back to David, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You okay?" he asked softly. David nodded, though his expression was somber. "Yeah, I just hate that it even had to go this far." Marcus sighed, his gaze briefly following the patrol car as it pulled away. "Sometimes people refuse to see reason, no matter how hard you try. But what matters is standing your ground and doing what's right." David nodded again, his grip tightening on the strap of his camera. "Thanks, Dad, for everything." Marcus smiled faintly, his hand resting on his son's shoulder. "Always, son. Let's head home." They began to walk toward the park's exit, the fading murmurs of the crowd behind them. Though the tension lingered in the air, there was a quiet sense of justice that settled over the scene, a reminder that prejudice and entitlement would not go unchecked. The ride to the police station was heavy with silence, the only sound the low hum of the car engine. David stared out the window, his hands gripping the strap of his camera bag as though it were a lifeline. The familiar streets of his neighborhood blurred past him, but they felt foreign now, like a place he no longer belonged. Marcus glanced at his son in the rearview mirror, his own heart heavy with the weight of the day. He had seen this kind of injustice before, countless times, but it was different now. It was personal. "David," Marcus said softly, breaking the silence. David didn't look up. "Yeah?" Marcus hesitated, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "I want you to know, none of this was your fault. Not a single part of it." David turned his head slightly, his expression a mix of anger and sadness. "I know, Dad. I don't get it. I wasn't doing anything. I wasn't hurting anyone. Why does it have to be like this?" Marcus's jaw clenched. He searched for the right words, but they felt inadequate against the enormity of the situation. Some people don't see the person in front of them, he said finally. They only see what they want to see, what fits their narrow world. David's voice trembled, but he forced it to remain steady. She saw a threat. All I had was a camera. And she saw a threat. Marcus exhaled slowly, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. She saw something she didn't understand. And instead of asking questions, she made assumptions. Dangerous ones. David pressed his forehead against the window, his breath fogging the glass. Do you think it'll ever change? People like her? The way they think? Marcus's heart ached at the question, but he didn't shy away from it. I don't know, son. I really don't. But what I do know is that we can't let them win. We can't let their hate take away our light. David turned to look at his father, his eyes searching for reassurance. Is that why you became a cop? To fight people like her? Marcus smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Partly, but mostly, I became a cop to protect people like you. To make sure that when someone tries to hurt you, there's someone standing in their way. The car fell silent again, but the tension had shifted. David leaned back in his seat, his grip on the camera bag loosening just slightly. He still felt the sting of Karen's words, but his father's presence was a reminder that he wasn't alone in this fight. As the station came into view, Marcus reached over and gave David's shoulder a gentle squeeze. We'll get through this, together. David nodded, his expression resolute. Together. The car pulled into the parking lot, the bright lights of the station illuminating the dark night. David straightened his shoulders, ready to face whatever came next. The fluorescent lights in the station buzzed faintly as Marcus and David stepped through the glass doors. David stayed close to his father, his camera bag clutched tightly in his hand. Despite his exhaustion, his mind raced. He replayed Karen's words in his head, the venom in her voice cutting deeper than he wanted to admit. Karen sat at a plastic chair near the front desk, her MAGA hat crooked and her hands cuffed behind her back. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, but the fury in her eyes betrayed her composure. The officers nearby were talking quietly, their eyes occasionally flicking to her. The moment Karen saw Marcus and David, her face twisted into a sneer. You, she hissed, her voice cutting through the low hum of the station. You've made a huge mistake. You'll regret this. You both will. Marcus's expression remained unreadable as he gestured for David to follow him. He approached the desk, speaking briefly with the officer on duty. Meanwhile, Karen's words grew louder and sharper, her frustration spilling out. This is harassment. I was doing my duty as a citizen, and you're treating me like a criminal. My lawyer is going to have a field day with this. Marcus turned to her, his tone calm but firm. Ma'am, you're here because of your own actions. Harassment, assault, and filing a false police report are serious charges. Karen struggled against her cuffs, her voice rising. Oh, please! Your kid was up to no good, and you know it. You're just covering for him, because you're his father. David stepped forward, his voice quiet but steady. I was sitting on a bench, taking pictures. That's all I was doing. You're the one who started yelling and calling the cops for no reason. Karen's glare turned to him. Don't talk to me like that, boy. You don't get to play the victim here. David clenched his fists, but Marcus stepped between them. His voice dropped, carrying a sharper edge. Enough. You've done enough damage today, ma'am. Karen smirked, leaning back in her chair. You think you've won? You have no idea who you're messing with. I have friends, powerful friends, people who won't take kindly to the way I've been treated. David frowned, glancing at his father. What's she talking about? Marcus didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained on Karen, his expression unreadable. I'm not concerned with your friends, ma'am. What I'm concerned with are the facts. And the facts are clear. Karen's smirk didn't waver. You'll see. You'll both see. The officer at the desk interrupted. Captain Carter, we've got her on record. But there's something you should see. He handed Marcus a file. Karen's expression flickered with something close to panic. You can't do this. You have no right to go through my personal information. Marcus ignored her, flipping through the pages. His expression darkened as he scanned the file, his jaw tightening slightly. David leaned closer. His curiosity piqued. "What is it, Dad?" Marcus closed the file with a quiet but deliberate snap. He turned to the officer. "Run a full background check and flag any connections to recent incidents in the area. Let me know what comes up." Karen's face turned pale. "You don't have the authority to do that. This is a setup. You're trying to pin something on me." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He turned to David, his voice calm but firm. "We're going to get some fresh air. Stay close." As they walked toward the station's exit, David glanced at his father, his heart pounding. What was in that file? Marcus didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "Let's just say there's more to Karen than meets the eye." David's brows furrowed. "More? Like what?" Marcus stopped just outside the station, his gaze distant. "She might not be as harmless as she seems. And if what's in that file checks out, this could get a lot more complicated." David swallowed hard, the day's events taking on a new and unsettling weight. "What do we do now?" Marcus placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his expression resolute. "We do what we always do, son. We stand tall and see this through." The air outside the station was cooler, but it did little to ease David's racing thoughts. He followed his father to a quieter spot near the parking lot, his curiosity bubbling over. Marcus leaned against the hood of his patrol car, the weight of the day clearly etched on his face. "Dad," David said hesitantly, breaking the silence. "What was in that file? What did it say about her?" Marcus exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's complicated, son. But let's just say Karen Whitman isn't exactly the model citizen she claims to be." David frowned, confusion mixing with unease. "What do you mean? What did they find?" Marcus crossed his arms, his tone measured. "There's evidence that Karen's been involved in a string of complaints. Harassment, intimidation, even a few cases of vandalism, all targeted at people she claimed didn't belong in her neighborhood." David's stomach twisted at the words. "You mean people like me?" Marcus nodded grimly. "It looks that way. And it's not just here. The file mentioned similar incidents in another town where she used to live. She left right before charges could be filed." David leaned against the car, his mind racing. "So, she's done this before? How is she not in jail?" Marcus's jaw tightened. Some people know how to manipulate the system. They make just enough noise to scare people, but not enough to get caught. She's been walking that line for a long time. David's anger flared. "And now she's trying to do it again, with us. What if she actually has those friends she was talking about?" Marcus placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "Let me worry about that. What matters is that we have her actions on record now, and if there's more to her story, we'll find it." Before David could respond, the station doors swung open, and one of Marcus's officers stepped out. He jogged over, a clipboard in hand. "Captain Carter, we've flagged some connections. You'll want to see this." Marcus took the clipboard and scanned the report. His expression darkened as he read the details. David shifted uncomfortably, watching his father closely. "What is it?" David asked, his voice cautious. Marcus handed the clipboard back to the officer. His tone clipped. "It's worse than I thought. Karen's been linked to a local group that's been spreading hate speech and organizing rallies under the guise of neighborhood preservation." David's eyes widened. "Wait, like a hate group?" Marcus nodded, his face grim. "Not officially. They're careful to stay just inside the law. But their actions speak for themselves. Karen's involvement isn't direct, but there's enough evidence to raise serious questions." David's mind reeled. The woman who had berated and humiliated him in the park wasn't just a neighborhood busybody. She was part of something much darker. "So, what happens now?" David asked, his voice steadier than he felt. Marcus straightened, his resolve clear. "We build a case. We follow the evidence and make sure people like her don't get to keep hiding behind lies and excuses." David looked up at his father, a spark of determination in his eyes. "What can I do to help?" Marcus gave him a faint smile. "You've already done more than enough, son. You stood your ground today, and that's more powerful than anything else. But if you want to help, keep being yourself. Keep using your voice. That's how we fight people like Karen. David nodded, the weight in his chest lifting slightly. He didn't feel entirely at peace, but knowing they were taking action gave him a sense of purpose. As they walked back toward the station, the gravity of the situation settled over them both. Karen's behavior wasn't just a moment of prejudice. It was a piece of a larger pattern. And now, the fight for justice had only just begun. Inside the station, the atmosphere was tense. Marcus and David stood near his office, while the officers worked around them. The quiet buzz of conversations and the occasional shuffle of papers filling the room. The weight of what they had just learned about Karen hung heavy in the air. David leaned against the wall, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. So, what happens next? Are you going to arrest her for being part of that group? Marcus shook his head, his voice steady but serious. It's not that simple, son. Her association with the group isn't enough to press charges. We need concrete evidence. Something that ties her to illegal activities. David frowned, frustration flickering in his eyes. But isn't what she's already done enough? She called the cops on me for no reason, lied to them, and then assaulted you. Isn't that enough to keep her locked up? Marcus nodded. It's enough to charge her for those specific crimes, and she'll face consequences for them. But if we want to expose the bigger picture, if we want to stop her from doing this again, we need more. David exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. How does someone like her keep getting away with this? She's hurt so many people, and she just moves on to the next place like nothing happened. Marcus placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. She's not getting away with it this time. We've got her actions on record, and the investigation into her connections is just starting. People like her thrive on fear and silence, but the more we shine a light on what they're doing, the harder it gets for them to hide. One of Marcus's officers approached, holding a small stack of files. Captain Carter, we've pulled together more information. These are complaints filed against Karen in her previous neighborhoods, and there's a pattern. Harassment, property damage, even allegations of threats. She's left a trail. Marcus took the files, flipping through them quickly. His eyes narrowed as he read. She's been careful, but not careful enough. If we can connect her actions here to her past behavior, we might be able to establish intent. David peered over his father's shoulder, his curiosity outweighing his unease. What kind of threats? The officer cleared her throat. Most of the complaints are vague. Things like, she said she'd make life difficult, or she made comments about people needing to leave the neighborhood. But a few of the reports mention specific incidents, like broken windows or cars being keyed after arguments with her. David's stomach twisted. She's done this to so many people, and no one stopped her? Marcus's jaw tightened. Not yet, but now we have a chance to make it stick. The officer hesitated before continuing. There's one more thing. We found social media posts linking her to some of the rallies held by that neighborhood preservation group. Nothing explicitly illegal, but enough to show she's involved. Marcus closed the file and handed it back to the officer. Good work. Keep digging. I want to know every detail about her connections and actions. The officer nodded and returned to her desk, leaving Marcus and David in a moment of quiet. David's voice was softer now, but no less resolute. She's not going to stop, is she? Even if she gets in trouble for what she did to me, she'll just find another place to start over. Marcus looked at his son, his expression firm. Not if we make sure she faces real accountability. This time, we're not letting her walk away. David nodded slowly, a spark of determination lighting in his eyes. What can I do? Marcus smiled faintly. You've already done a lot, son. Your strength today showed people who she really is. But if you want to help more, we'll need to gather statements from people she's hurt. People in the community who are ready to speak up. That could make all the difference. David straightened, his resolve solidifying. Okay, let's do it. Marcus nodded, pride flickering across his face. Let's do it. As they walked back toward the desk to begin the next steps, the hum of the station seemed quieter, more focused. The fight against Karen wasn't over, but for the first time, It felt like progress was being made. The video of Karen's park confrontation spread faster than wildfire. By the morning after her arrest, it was plastered across every major social media platform. The clip, recorded by a bystander, perfectly captured her berating David, yelling inflammatory remarks, and being led away in handcuffs by Marcus. It was only a matter of hours before hashtags like #YarChuThi, Justice for David, and Park Karen began trending. News outlets picked up the story, airing segments with titles like "Local Woman Sparks Outrage After Calling Police on Black Teenager" and "Community in Uproar Over False Police Report." Clips of Karen's face, twisted in anger, looped endlessly, interspersed with sound bites from bystanders, recounting what they'd seen. Social media responses ranged from outrage to calls for systemic change. Comments poured in, "This is why we need to address everyday racism. It's not just big events. It's moments like this. She's the kind of person who makes communities unsafe. Kudos to the teen and his dad for handling this so well. Her employer needs to see this." Does Greenhill Realty support this kind of behavior? Within hours, Karen's name and job were revealed by internet sleuths. A tweet tagged Greenhill Realty, saying, "Karen Whitman is supposed to be in charge of community outreach. Is this the kind of outreach you stand for?" The post included screenshots of her profile on a professional networking site and contact information for her company. The backlash was swift. By midday, Greenhill Realty issued a public statement. "We do not condone the actions of Karen Whitman. Her behavior does not align with our company's values of inclusion and respect. Effective immediately, she is no longer employed with Greenhill Realty." David saw the statement on his phone as he sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through the flood of posts. "Dad!" he called out, holding up his phone. "She got fired." Marcus walked over, glancing at the screen. His expression was calm, but his voice carried a note of caution. "Actions have consequences. But remember, this doesn't mean it's over. Stay focused." Karen sat in a holding cell at the station, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the metal bench. She had spent the night listening to the buzz of voices outside the bars, trying to convince herself this would all blow over. Her lawyer, a sharp-eyed man in his 40s, sat across from her on the other side of the bars, reviewing his notes. "They fired me!" Karen spat, her voice laced with disbelief and fury. Just like that. No phone call, no explanation. Just a cold email saying, "I'm no longer employed." Her lawyer didn't look up. "Considering the video that's been circulating, I'm not surprised. You've gone viral, Karen. And not in a good way." Karen's jaw tightened. "It's all lies. That video, it doesn't show the full story. They're making me out to be a monster, when all I was doing was protecting my community." The lawyer finally looked up, his expression a mix of weariness and irritation. "You're not helping yourself by sticking to that narrative. The video is damning. It shows you yelling at a teenager, accusing him of things you couldn't prove, and then assaulting a police officer. That's all anyone cares about." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line, but the redness creeping up her neck betrayed her frustration. "I was doing the right thing. He didn't belong there, and I had every right to question him." The lawyer sighed, rubbing his temples. "The court of public opinion doesn't care about your intentions. They care about what they see. And right now, what they see is someone who made a fool of herself and broke the law in the process." Karen's eyes flashed with anger. "They don't know what it's like, dealing with people like him. The boy was being disrespectful, and his father abused his authority to humiliate me. That's the real story here." The lawyer leaned forward, his tone sharper. "Karen, if you want any chance of coming out of this without serious legal consequences, you need to start thinking about damage control. That means cooperating and showing remorse." Karen scoffed, her voice dripping with disdain. "Remorse? For what? For standing up for what's right? You're as useless as everyone else." The lawyer stood, gathering his papers. "If that's your attitude, then there's not much I can do for you." As he walked away, Karen slumped back against the bench, her mind racing. The buzz of voices outside the cell was louder now, and she knew the world was watching. The sound of the station around her felt distant. Officers talking, phones ringing, the occasional clatter of a door. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She had been fired, just like that. An email, cold and impersonal, had stripped her of her job and, in her mind, her dignity. The humiliation of being escorted through the park in handcuffs and thrown into a cell was one thing. Losing her career was another. They don't even know the full story, she muttered to herself. I was protecting this neighborhood. They'll regret turning on me. Her mind raced with thoughts of vengeance, but as the minutes passed, the reality of her situation began to sink in. She had no allies left. Her lawyer was losing patience, her neighbors were turning against her, and her name was all over the news. Meanwhile, back at the station, Marcus sat in his office, sifting through the growing pile of complaints and evidence coming in from Karen's neighbors. Each new report added to the picture of a woman who had spent years intimidating those around her. One particularly damning statement caught his eye. A detailed account of Karen targeting a black family that had moved in 2 years ago. The father described finding threatening notes in their mailbox, their property vandalized, and Karen openly confronting them about bringing down the neighborhood. Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He knew this wasn't just about the park anymore. It was bigger than David's experience. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. One of his officers poked her head in. Captain, another neighbor's here. Says she has something important to share. Marcus nodded, gesturing for her to bring them in. An older woman with a weathered face entered the office, clutching a stack of papers. She introduced herself as Mrs. Langley and explained that she'd lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years. I've been quiet about this for too long, she began, her voice steady but tinged with regret. I thought if I ignored her, she'd leave me alone, but she didn't. She laid the papers on Marcus's desk. They included copies of emails Karen had sent over the years, each one full of veiled threats and condescending remarks. Mrs. Langley pointed to one in particular. This was after my daughter married a black man, she said. Think about the kind of message you're sending to the neighborhood, she wrote. We work hard to keep this area respectable. David, who had been standing quietly in the corner, felt his stomach turn. She actually sent that? Mrs. Langley nodded, and when we invited our in-laws over for a barbecue, someone spray-painted, "Go back to where you belong" on my driveway. I can't prove it was her, but I know it was. Marcus nodded, his voice calm. Thank you for coming forward. People like you speaking out make a difference. As Mrs. Langley left, Marcus turned to David. This is what happens when people feel emboldened by silence. But now, that silence is breaking. In the holding cell, Karen leaned her head back against the wall, trying to steady her breathing. She could hear murmurs outside, voices she couldn't quite make out. A sense of unease crept over her. The sound of keys jingling snapped her out of her thoughts. A guard approached, unlocking the cell door. Whitman, your lawyer's here. Judge approved your release on bail. Karen stood, smoothing her shirt, as though she were about to walk into a meeting instead of out of a cell. Her lawyer stood nearby, his face stern. This doesn't mean you're off the hook, he said sharply. You'll be under strict conditions until your hearing. Don't make things worse for yourself. Karen's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. As she stepped out of the cell and walked toward the processing desk, she caught sight of Marcus and David down the hallway. They were speaking to a group of neighbors, faces she recognized, all of them glaring in her direction. Her steps faltered, and for the first time, she felt a pang of genuine fear. The neighbors continued to file into the station, each one bringing stories, photos, and documents that painted an increasingly damning picture of Karen's behavior. A man in his 30s showed a video of Karen yelling at him for hosting a cookout with his black friends. She said we were bringing the wrong kind of crowd into the area, he explained, his voice tight with anger. Another neighbor, a younger woman, produced a letter Karen had left on her doorstep after she rented her home to a black family. "You should think about the type of tenants you're inviting into this community," she read aloud, her voice shaking. The stories came in waves, each one adding weight to the evidence against Karen. David listened intently, his anger mingling with a growing sense of resolve. "This isn't just about me," he whispered to Marcus during a break. "She's been hurting people for years." Marcus nodded, his expression resolute. "And now, for the first time, people aren't afraid to stand up to her. That's what makes this different." Karen sat in her lawyer's car outside the station, staring out the window at the small crowd of neighbors entering. Her lawyer's voice was a distant hum, explaining the terms of her release, but Karen barely heard him, her eyes fixed on the station door, where Marcus and David stood surrounded by people she once dismissed as insignificant. Her grip tightened on her purse as a bitter thought crossed her mind. They'll regret this. All of them. Karen's release on bail did little to slow the momentum against her. Every day brought new voices from the community, each adding to the pile of evidence stacked against her. The public outcry refused to fade, with headlines and social media posts keeping her actions in the spotlight. Marcus stood in his office late one evening, flipping through the thick file that had grown over the weeks. Statements, photographs, videos. Each piece painted a damning picture of Karen's years of harassment and intimidation. David sat nearby, his camera resting on his lap, scrolling through the latest news coverage of the case. "It's overwhelming," David said, breaking the silence. "Every time I think we've heard it all, someone else comes forward." Marcus nodded, his face grim. "It's because people feel safe now. They know they're not alone, and they know she can't intimidate them anymore." David looked up, his expression serious. "Do you think it'll be enough? In court, I mean?" Marcus set the file down, his eyes meeting his son's. "I do. She's left too much behind. This trial isn't just about what she did to you. It's about everything she's done to this community. And when the truth comes out, it'll be impossible to ignore." As Marcus spoke, his phone buzzed on the desk. He picked it up and read the message, his lips pressing into a thin line. "What is it?" David asked. "The trial date's been set," Marcus replied, his voice steady. "It's time to see this through." Karen's trial became the talk of the town, her name plastered across headlines and whispered in conversations throughout the community. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with neighbors, reporters, and community members who had been following the case closely. Karen sat at the defense table, her face pale but her posture stiff, trying to project an air of defiance. Her lawyer shuffled papers beside her, muttering hurried instructions that she barely seemed to hear. The prosecution wasted no time laying out its case, starting with the park incident that had sparked everything. They played the viral video for the jury, letting Karen's own words and actions condemn her. Then came the barrage of witness testimonies. "This isn't an isolated incident," the prosecutor said, pacing before the jury. "What you'll see over the course of this trial is a consistent pattern of intimidation, harassment, and prejudice that has spanned years. The defendant has abused her position in the community to bully and silence those she deemed unworthy of living in her neighborhood." The witnesses painted a damning picture. "She left threats in my mailbox after my family moved in," one man testified. "When I didn't respond, she keyed my car and spray-painted racial slurs on my garage. My kids were terrified. She harassed my tenants until they broke their lease," another woman said, her voice trembling. "When I confronted her, she told me I should rent to the right kind of people." One after another, Karen's neighbors came forward with their stories. Each one added weight to the case, making it harder for the defense to argue that Karen's actions were a misunderstanding or a single lapse in judgment. Marcus took the stand midway through the trial, his testimony calm and precise. He recounted the events at the park, his interactions with Karen, and the mounting evidence that had come to light since her arrest. "As a police officer, I've seen people like her before," he said. "They hide behind the guise of concern for the community, but their actions reveal the truth. It's not about safety, it's about control. And when someone challenges that control, they lash out." When Karen herself took the stand, The tension in the room was palpable. She spoke haltingly, her usual bluster gone, replaced by a strained defensiveness. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," she said, her voice cracking. "I thought I was doing the right thing, protecting my neighborhood. I didn't realize it would escalate like this." The prosecutor's cross-examination was merciless. Protecting your neighborhood? By filing false reports? By harassing and threatening families who didn't look like you? You didn't think it would escalate because for years it didn't. Because no one held you accountable, Karen stammered, her composure crumbling under the weight of the questioning. I was misunderstood." "Misunderstood?" The prosecutor leaned forward, "or emboldened by the silence of those around you. You thrived on fear, Ms. Whitman, but now the silence is broken." The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning with their verdict. Guilty on all counts. Karen's sentencing was harsh. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with years of experience handling cases of harassment, didn't mince words. "Ms. Whitman, your actions have caused irreparable harm to this community. You have targeted families, destroyed property, and undermined the very fabric of neighborhood trust. Your attempts to frame yourself as a concerned citizen are nothing more than a thinly veiled excuse for your prejudice. This court will not tolerate such behavior." Karen was sentenced to 6 months in jail, 3 years of probation, and mandatory participation in a rehabilitation program for hate-based offenses. In addition, she was ordered to pay significant restitution to the families she had harmed and barred from holding leadership positions in any neighborhood or community organization for the rest of her life. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as the sentence was read. Karen sat motionless, her face blank, as though she couldn't comprehend the severity of her punishment. Outside the courthouse, Marcus and David stood among a crowd of neighbors, their presence a quiet reassurance that justice had been served. The mood was somber but hopeful, a shared sense of relief that Karen's reign of intimidation had finally come to an end. David turned to his father, his expression thoughtful. "Do you think this is enough? Do you think she'll change?" Marcus looked at his son, his voice steady but reflective. "I don't know if she'll change, but this isn't about her anymore. It's about everyone else. About making sure people know they don't have to stay silent, that they can stand up and be heard." David nodded slowly, a faint smile breaking through the seriousness of his expression. "I guess that's what matters most." Marcus placed a hand on his son's shoulder, pride evident in his eyes. "It is, and you were part of that, David. You stood your ground, and because of that, others found the courage to stand with you." As they walked away from the courthouse, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm light over the steps. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time in years, the community felt united. A place where voices were heard, and justice was more than just a word. The weeks following Karen's sentencing marked the end of an era for the neighborhood. With her gone, the community began to heal, but her absence left a scar, a reminder of the harm she had caused over the years. Karen's fall from grace was complete. Once a self-appointed authority in the neighborhood, she now found herself ostracized and alone. The jail sentence stripped her of the control she had clung to for so long, and the restitution payments drained the savings she had spent years amassing. Her name became synonymous with the prejudice and entitlement that had fueled her actions. Inside her cell, Karen sat on a narrow cot, staring at the bare walls. The anger that had once burned so fiercely within her had dimmed, replaced by a hollow emptiness. She replayed the events of the trial in her mind. The damning testimonies, the glares from former neighbors, and the judge's cutting words. For the first time, Karen began to understand that her control had never been real. She had built her power on intimidation and silence, and when those were taken away, there was nothing left. Meanwhile, life in the neighborhood continued, but with a newfound sense of unity. Community meetings, once contentious and tense, became opportunities for dialogue and collaboration. Neighbors who had previously avoided each other began to connect, sharing stories and finding common ground. Marcus and David noticed the changes during their evening walks. observing how people seemed more willing to engage and less hesitant to speak up. One night, as they sat on their porch, the conversation turned to everything that had happened. "Do you think she regrets it?" David asked, his voice thoughtful. Marcus considered the question, his gaze fixed on the street. "Maybe, but regret doesn't always lead to change. What's important is that she can't hurt anyone else, at least not here." David nodded, his camera resting on his lap. "I guess it's not about her anymore, is it?" Marcus smiled faintly. "No, it's not. It's about what we do next, how we keep moving forward." David looked out at the street, where kids played and neighbors chatted, a scene that had felt impossible just months ago. "It feels different now, like people aren't afraid anymore." "That's because they're not," Marcus said. "When you stood your ground in that park, you showed them it was possible. And when people started speaking up, they realized they weren't alone." David glanced at his father, a small smile on his face. "I didn't think it would matter that much. I just didn't want to back down." Marcus placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his voice filled with pride. "That's all it takes sometimes. One person standing up, refusing to be silenced. You made a difference, David. Never forget that." The two sat quietly for a while, the hum of the neighborhood around them. The work wasn't finished. There would always be challenges, always be those who tried to divide. But for now, there was hope. And that was enough. As the stars began to dot the night sky, Marcus looked at his son and said, "Change doesn't happen all at once, but this was a step in the right direction. And sometimes, that's all we need to keep going." David nodded, his smile widening. One step at a time. Together they sat on the porch, ready to face whatever came next, knowing they had the strength to stand up for what was right, no matter how long the fight.